Ethan never wanted fame, but one photo he captured changed everything the moment it hit the internet. A towering Apache woman with haunting eyes that looked painfully alive, as if she were staring straight through the screen into the soul of anyone who dared to look. People called it art, a miracle, a historic discovery, but Ethan knew the truth that no one else could even imagine. When he pressed the shutter that evening in the Forbidden Canyon, he didn't just capture her image. He felt the air freeze, the ground tremble, and a cold force rush straight through him like a silent scream. Since that moment, every night he heard soft cries echo inside his room, and the woman's face in the photo began changing, shifting, pleading. What he took wasn't a picture. What he took belonged to her tribe, her blood, her spirit. He had captured her soul. Ethan was never the kind of man who believed in legends. Yet everything changed the moment he stepped into the forbidden Apache Canyon with his camera hanging loosely around his neck. He came searching for rare landscapes, but instead he found something far greater and far more dangerous. A giant Apache woman whose presence felt ancient, sacred, and impossibly powerful. When he lifted his camera and pressed the shutter, he felt a sudden pull, like the air itself had turned into a living force. And in that single flash of light her spirit was sucked inside the lens without a sound. Ethan didn't understand what he had done until the nights grew colder, the shadows grew longer, and he felt her trapped presence following him everywhere. And when her tribe discovered the truth, they didn't come with words. They came with fury, heartbreak, and centuries of spiritual strength demanding her soul back. Ethan pushed forward even as the air around him thickened with an invisible weight, the canyon narrowing into a long corridor of stone that felt more like a throat than a path, and every sound he made seemed swallowed before it could echo back to him, as if something ahead was absorbing every vibration. He wiped the sweat from his palms, steadied his camera, and kept walking, telling himself the strange chill crawling across his skin was only the wind. Yet deep inside he knew something ancient was awake and watching him with silent judgment. The light dimmed without warning, shadows stretching unnaturally across the ground, shifting like living shapes that moved just a second after he did, following him with slow, deliberate intention. A distant hum floated through the canyon, low and rhythmic like a heartbeat buried beneath the earth, and Ethan felt it pulse through his chest, shaking him with a strange mixture of fear and awe. His breath grew unsteady when he noticed the symbols carved into the canyon walls, giant handprints, arrows pointing inward, and circles etched so deeply they looked burned into the rock by something far older than human tools. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, but his curiosity dragged him forward until he reached a narrow ridge overlooking a hidden valley untouched by time. The moment he stepped onto the ridge, the wind stopped completely, the silence turning so sharp it felt like pressure on his ears, and a faint tremor crawled up from the ground as if footsteps were approaching from beneath the soil. Ethan slowly lifted his camera, not to take a picture but to steady himself, because something enormous was emerging from the far side of the valley, a silhouette growing taller with every second. His heartbeat hammered as the figure stepped into the fading sunlight. A woman taller than any human he had ever seen, wrapped in traditional Apache markings glowing faintly along her arms and chest, her long dark hair swaying in the still air like strands of shadow. Her presence felt ancient, protective, and overwhelmingly powerful, and though she said nothing, Ethan felt her gaze pierce through him with a mix of sorrow and warning. He tried to lower the camera, but his hands moved on their own, as if guided by an unseen force, lifting the lens toward her face even as every part of him whispered not to. The woman took one slow step forward, her expression shifting from stern calm to sudden alarm, and before Ethan could stop himself, his finger pressed the shutter. A flash erupted, brighter than any light he had ever seen, bursting outward like a silent explosion that rattled his bones and tore through the air. The woman's body froze mid-step, her eyes widening not with fear, but with pain as a swirling glow rose from her chest, winding upward like smoke before slamming into the camera with a force that knocked Ethan to his knees. He gasped for breath as the glow vanished inside the lens, the canyon falling into a suffocating stillness. And when he looked up, the place where the giant woman had stood was empty, leaving behind only the echo of her presence pressing against his trembling heart. Ethan remained frozen on his knees, his breath shaking as the fading light revealed the empty space where the giant woman had stood only seconds before, and the canyon felt heavier now, as if every stone and shadow knew exactly what he had done even before he could understand it himself. His fingers trembled around the camera, the metal warm like it was holding something alive, and a faint vibration pulsed through it, gentle but steady, almost like a heartbeat trapped behind the glass. He forced himself to rise, though his legs felt hollow, and when he looked toward the valley again, he sensed movement behind him, slow and deliberate, like someone gathering strength before stepping into the world again. He turned with hesitant dread, and the giant Apache woman appeared once more, not solid this time, but faint and shimmering, her form bending like light filtering through rising heat. Her expression held no anger, only deep sadness, and Ethan's chest tightened as he realized she wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the camera with a grief so raw it made the air around her ripple. She lifted her hand as if reaching for something precious taken from her, but when her translucent fingers brushed the lens, the glow inside flickered wildly, pulling at her spirit like an unseen force desperate to keep her from breaking free. Ethan stumbled back, horrified as her form flickered, stretching thin before snapping back toward the canyon floor where her physical body still lay motionless, her massive frame silent and still like a fallen monument. The ground beneath him hummed with low vibrations, carrying a sorrow that didn't feel human, and every instinct he had screamed that he needed to leave, but every step he tried to take felt anchored by the weight of the life he had trapped. The woman's spirit drifted toward her body again, bending with quiet desperation as she tried to settle back into it. Yet each attempt was ripped away as the camera pulled harder, dragging her essence like a tide she could not fight. Ethan watched helplessly, guilt rising like a knot in his throat, and for the first time since entering the canyon, he realized that what he had captured was never meant to be touched by mortal hands. A cold gust cut through the valley, carrying a distant murmur that grew louder, echoing off the stone walls until it sounded like voices gathering from every direction, rising with urgency and warning. The woman's spirit jerked violently, pulled backward in a sudden snap that sent her drifting form slamming into the camera's glow before it swallowed her completely, leaving only a faint shimmer in the air where her sorrow had lingered. Ethan staggered back, clutching the camera tightly as the last trace of her vanished, and the moment the canyon fell silent again, he knew he was no longer alone in his mistake. The earth itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the ones who would come for what he had taken. ChatGPT said. Ethan's grip tightened around the camera as the last shimmer of the Apache woman's spirit faded, and for a long moment, he stood frozen, unable to breathe, unable to think, trapped in the echo of a silence that felt too heavy to belong to the living world. His instincts finally broke through the shock, urging him to run. So he turned sharply and pushed himself toward the canyon path, but each step felt dragged down by a weight pressing hard against his chest, as if invisible hands were holding him back. He forced himself forward until he reached a flatter stretch of rock, where he paused to suck in a breath and wipe the sweat from his brow, only to feel the camera shake again with a small pulse that crawled straight into his spine. He lifted it with trembling fingers, hoping the strange sensation was only his imagination. But when he glanced at the screen, every single photo he had taken earlier had changed, each frame replaced by the towering woman's face staring directly at him. Her expressions were no longer still. They shifted with every blink he took. First calm, then sorrowful, then frightened, then pleading, as if she were begging for breath from inside the lens. Ethan's heartbeat hammered violently, and he dropped the camera against his chest, stumbling backward as the soft sound of her cry seemed to slip out of the speaker, faint but unmistakable. Guilt stabbed through him with startling force, so sharp it made his vision blur, because he now understood that she wasn't gone. She was trapped, struggling, reaching for any chance to break free. He tried to steady his breath, but the air felt colder, heavier, almost icy as it pushed into his lungs, and he sensed something watching him from the canyon walls, something ancient and furious, something tied to the woman he had just stolen without meaning to. He turned again to run, but the shadows shifted in his path, stretching long like tendrils trying to pull him back toward the valley where she had fallen. Every sound in the canyon twisted into strange whispers that rose and fell like distant voices calling her name, and Ethan felt his stomach knot with fear because the whispers didn't sound angry, they sounded heartbroken. His steps grew unsteady as he pushed forward, but the guilt only tightened around him, a suffocating pressure that made his chest ache as if her sorrow had wrapped itself around his heart. The camera vibrated again, harder this time, and he dared to look down once more, only to see her face pressed against the inside of the glass, lips parted in silent desperation, eyes filled with unbearable pain. Ethan staggered and sank to one knee, tears burning behind his eyes, because he finally understood the truth. He hadn't taken a picture, he had taken a life, and the weight crushing his chest was not fear alone. It was her plea, her grief, her trapped spirit begging him to make it right before the ones who loved her arrived to reclaim what he had stolen. Ethan forced himself to stand even as the crushing weight around his chest tightened with every breath, and he pushed forward through the narrowing trail until he reached the small clearing where he had set his camp earlier, hoping the familiar sight would steady his shaking mind. But the moment he stepped onto the flat ground, the earth shuddered beneath his feet with a deep roar that rolled through the canyon like thunder trapped underground. He stumbled, dropping to his hands as the trembling grew stronger, and when he lifted his head, towering shadows fell across the clearing, stretching longer and darker with each passing second until the air felt thick with an ancient force rising from the land itself. One by one, figures emerged from the edges of the canyon. Giant Apache warriors with broad shoulders, painted chests, and solemn faces carved with sorrow more than rage, their presence so powerful that the wind seemed to bend away from them in silent respect. Ethan's breath caught as they moved in slow, unified steps, surrounding his camp with a circle so precise it felt rehearsed through generations. And the moment they closed in, the silence snapped into place like a trap that had finally sprung. The leader stepped forward, taller than the rest, his long braids swaying gently as he stared at Ethan with eyes that carried centuries of history and grief. And when he spoke, his voice trembled not from fear, but from heartbreak. He said, "You stole her soul, and she is our guardian," each word heavy like stones falling into Ethan's chest. Ethan shook his head, voice breaking as he tried to explain that he didn't understand what he had done, but the leader raised a hand, silencing him with a gesture that held more authority than any threat. The warriors stepped closer, their calm faces shadowed by pain, and Ethan realized they were not here to punish him. They were here to recover someone they loved, someone they trusted, someone who had protected them long before his lifetime. The ground vibrated again as the leader knelt before Ethan, placing one enormous hand on the dirt, and the earth beneath them pulsed like a heartbeat echoing through the stone. "Her spirit cries from your device," the leader whispered, eyes flicking to the camera hanging at Ethan's side, and Ethan flinched as the device vibrated violently, the faint sound of her trapped voice trembling against the glass. The warriors inhaled sharply, their expressions twisting with anguish as if they could hear her too, and the leader rose slowly, his jaw tightening with resolve. Ethan felt his legs weaken as the circle of warriors closed in tighter, not with anger, but with an overwhelming wave of sorrow that washed over him like a cold tide, and he understood that he stood not among enemies, but among people mourning the loss of someone sacred. The leader reached out his hand, not to strike, but to demand what belonged to them, and Ethan, trembling and breathless, realized he no longer had a choice. The tribe had come to reclaim their guardian, and they would not leave without her soul. Ethan felt the circle of towering warriors closing in, but the weight crushing his chest was no longer fear of them. It was the unbearable guilt twisting inside him until his voice cracked and he dropped to his knees, clutching the camera like it was both a curse and a confession. His breath came uneven as he choked out the words he had been trying to deny since the moment the shutter clicked, telling them he never meant to hurt her, never meant to take something sacred, never meant to steal the spirit of a woman he didn't even understand. His voice trembled with raw regret, echoing through the canyon with a fragile honesty that made even the wind hesitate, and the warriors, though immense and powerful, looked at him with heavy eyes that held a sorrow older than his entire lifetime. Their faces softened, not with forgiveness, but with a shared grief that wrapped the clearing in a silence deeper than any threat. One of the younger warriors stepped forward, his posture steady but his voice shaking as he whispered that she had protected them for generations, standing between their people and every danger the world tried to push into their sacred land. And without her, they felt exposed, fractured, as if a part of their very soul had been torn away. Ethan's heart clenched when he heard those words, because he realized she had not been just a guardian of stone and legend. She had been living history, a protector who carried the weight of her tribe's survival on her massive shoulders, and he had stolen her from them with a single careless moment. He lifted his gaze slowly, letting them see the pain in his eyes, the desperation in his shaking hands, and the shame that wrapped around him like cold chains, and the warriors looked back at him with an expression that blended mourning with a grief so deep it almost felt like an invisible wound across the air. The leader stepped closer, his shadow falling over Ethan like a reminder of everything he had endangered. Yet his voice carried no anger as he told Ethan that intention did not erase the damage, and sorrow alone could not return a spirit once taken from its rightful place. Ethan swallowed hard, tears burning behind his eyes as he admitted that he felt her struggling inside the lens every time he tried to take a step, that he heard her silent cries in the stillness, that her presence weighed on him like a plea he could not ignore. The warriors' expressions tightened, their grief deepening as they realized she was suffering inside the device, not gone, not forgotten, but trapped in a space too small to contain a being who once carried the strength of mountains. Ethan bowed his head, trembling as he asked what he could do to make it right, and the leader, voice low with resolve and heartbreak, told him there was only one path left. He would have to walk it with them, face the spiritual storm he had unleashed, and give everything he had to free the woman whose power had protected their bloodline long before he ever touched a camera. Ethan rose slowly as the leader's final words settled in the air like a warning carried on ancient wind, and before he could gather his breath, the warriors closed around him, guiding him back toward the same canyon where everything had gone wrong, their steps heavy and synchronized, shaking the ground with a rhythm that felt older than language. The journey back was suffocating. Every shadow seemed to watch. Every gust of air felt like a whisper from the trapped guardian begging him to hurry before the last thread of her strength vanished inside the device he still held with trembling hands. By the time they reached the valley ridge, the sky had darkened into deep red streaked with purple, as if the land itself sensed what was about to unfold. The warriors formed a circle around the spot where her massive body lay still, their faces set with solemn determination as they placed carved stones around the perimeter, each stone glowing faintly when pressed into the earth. Without a word, drums thundered to life, slow and haunting, echoing against the canyon walls until the ground vibrated like a living creature waking from centuries of silence. Flames shot upward from the center of the circle, twisting into spirals that reached toward the sky as the tribe began chanting in low, mournful tones that made Ethan's heart pound with an emotion he couldn't name. The leader motioned for Ethan to step forward, and the moment he entered the circle, the air grew violently cold, the kind of cold that seeped into bone and pressed against the heart like invisible fingers closing in. The camera jerked violently, almost ripping from his hands, shaking with a force that made him stumble, as if the trapped spirit was fighting the ritual with every last breath. The flames twisted higher, turning blue at the tips, and Ethan felt a sudden rush of heat slam into his chest, knocking the wind from him as the leader warned that if the ritual broke before completion, her soul would remain imprisoned forever and Ethan's own spirit would be pulled into the void she left behind. His knees buckled as the chant grew louder, the drums deeper, the light brighter, and a swirling column of energy rose from the fire and wrapped around him like a storm of shimmering air. The camera vibrated so violently he feared it would shatter, and when he lifted it with shaking arms, he saw her enormous face pressed against the inside of the lens, eyes wide with fear and exhaustion, silently begging to be freed. The warriors pounded their spears into the earth, sending tremors through the ground, forcing the spirit upward, and Ethan felt something tug at his own chest like a hook dragging at his soul. He gasped as the leader shouted that he must hold on, that he must not let go no matter how painful it became, and the ritual pulled harder, light tearing through the air as the boundary between their world and hers thinned to a razor edge. Ethan screamed as the force surged through him. The fire roared higher, and the chanting reached a desperate peak, because this moment would decide everything: her freedom, their survival, and his own life hanging on the edge of the spirit storm unfolding around him. The canyon fell into a trembling silence as the last shards of light faded, and Ethan stood frozen, watching the giant Apache woman hover between the world of spirits and the world of men, her form glowing like a memory, fighting its way back to life. As the tribe gathered around her, their chants rising like ancient winds, she lifted her gaze to Ethan, not with rage, but with a soft, sorrowful understanding that struck deeper than any punishment. In that single look, she returned everything he had taken, not through force, but through forgiveness. The ground pulsed, the rocks echoed, and with a final breath of freedom she rose, leaving behind only dust and peace. The tribe carried her home, their silhouettes melting into the desert dusk, while Ethan remained alone in the vast canyon, shaken, humbled, and forever marked by the spirit he had freed and the guilt he would never fully escape.